think it will help if you could just clarify it. I think what you're saying is it is behind that noise, or I guess the question, and I think it's similar to the question I just asked. You measured 35
Correct.
as ambient, and then the on-site mechanical sound that is predicted, you're saying will be background to that? It's not additive to that?
No, it's not background, and,
Okay.
and it's not added as far as compliance with the state code.
No, I'm not talking about the code, I'm talking about the actual,
I know what you're saying. Let me finish. If you wanted to take the existing and add the 31 to that, okay, the maximum increase in noise level, combining those two, would be 37.5 to 38 decibels, no more than 3 decibels, okay? So that would give you a noise level of, let's say, 38, okay? That still would be below the code, if you were.
and is that a physics formula where you add the two, you don't add as normal addition? Is it?
Oh, absolutely not. It's a logarithmic function. If you have two identical sound levels, say 35 and a 35, the maximum increase would be 3 decibels. So that sound level you would hear from two identical sources would go up by 3 decibels to 38. Okay, now, a 3 decibel increase is a barely perceptible increase. Most people could not tell the difference between a 35 and a 32 decibel noise level. I can give you another example if this would help. If I was sitting here and I had a piece of plywood up and I had an alarm clock set up behind it, and I had the alarm running, whatever noise, you couldn't see what I was doing. I had one alarm clock, and you were hearing 35 decibels. I put another alarm clock there and turn it on. You would be hearing 38 decibels theoretically, but you wouldn't know that there were two alarm clocks on. Most people could not tell the difference between a 3 decibel change in noise.
So it would be louder, but I wouldn't know why.
It's not loud. Well, no, it's 31. So 31 with 35, would give, it would be about maybe 2 decibels louder, yes. And you wouldn't know why, or you wouldn't notice, is what I'm saying. You're right. What you said was correct. It would be slightly louder, but you wouldn't notice, and you wouldn't really hear the difference.
I know we're not talking about the other hearing, but it's hard for me to forget, Mr. Potenta, that at the other hearing, you originally told us we wouldn't be able, there were no sound issues at all, and then the board insisted and you did the testing, and then you came back and said, oh yeah, we need a sound wall because it exceeds the allowed sound.
That's not the case. We brought in Mr. Potenta, who did the testing and presented his report to you. What had happened was originally Mr. Sanders was giving you information that he knew in terms of the local standards and the state standards that he believed we would comply with, and we do indeed comply with. But you had asked for a more detailed analysis,
So
and
Mr.
that's...
Potenta testified after the test was done, not before the test was done?
We,
Is that right?
you had asked for a sound expert, so we hired Mr. Potenta, and he did testing and presented a report to you.
We asked for a sound expert because the original, we weren't comfortable with the original data.
Well, we did not have a sound expert originally at all. We didn't have a sound study done. We weren't aware that that was something the board was going to be interested in.
Okay.
So then what we did is we went out and hired Mr. Potenta. He did his testing, and he came in and presented his report to you.
And then you said the sound wall is necessary.
In order to meet the ambient standard that the board was asking us to meet. Yes. But he never came in and presented one set of testing or one
Okay.
report and then a later
Then I'm
report.
not remembering correctly, so thank you.
It was a long time ago.
Yes, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. Greg, Mary Ann, no other questions, Dave?
No, nothing.
No? Board?
Yeah, I guess I have a few questions. So the manufacturer puts out how many decibels this, this regulator puts out, which is 84, am I correct?
84 at 1 meter from the
Okay.
unit.
And then there was another independent company, I think you had mentioned, right, that I guess solidified what the decibels. Did you say something about there being another company, a third party?
No, I said normally, when we go to a manufacturer on any piece of equipment, we ask them for the spec sheet on the equipment. And typically, they give us a sheet that was provided by an independent test company. Because I called up manufacturers and they send me something handwritten, and I said, we can't use that. I need a certified test by an independent company that tells what those noise levels are. So that's what they provided, that's what we used.
Okay, so you have basically the documentation from an independent company that did this testing. My biggest problem with this is that, with the sound portion of this, is that I look at something that's the size of a small locomotive that you're telling me is 84 decibels. Now, I don't understand when you talk decibels. You've explained yourself and explained very well the
Can I just
idea of-
interrupt, if you're talking about the heater,
Oh, yeah.
that's not 84. The regulator is 84.
Then
The heater-
I'm referring to the regulator,
Okay.
the higher of the two.
Okay.
So when I look at the unit that was, I don't know the.
That's the
actual-
heater.
That's the heater.
Okay, the regulator is exactly where? Is it underneath this? Is it part of it? Is it?
I think you're making reference to
No, it is a good-
general exhibit that we admitted into evidence at the last hearing, and
Yes.
that's the regulator.
So between the regulator and the heater, when I look at just the size of everything, all the components here, and I don't have the experience to tell you in terms of decibels, but I have some experience with gas lines. And, I mean, I have a 6-inch gas line outside one of my buildings, and we have a decent amount of pressure that goes through it, and you hear it whistling from a good distance away. It's not necessarily the equipment that you hear, you actually hear the flow of gas. I struggle with the idea of this being installed and whatever meters we gauge the decibels and whatever we are able to test the sound at that home, and I'm going to say it was number 3 on that map. What happens at that point? What happens when it's more than what we're being led to believe now? In other words, do we go back to New Jersey Natural Gas and say, okay, in spite of the experts and the documentation that you guys ultimately got and put in front of this board, it's not correct. You do hear it. I put myself in the shoes of the person living in that house that doesn't hear anything right now. And I get the whole inherently beneficial thing and why this is important. But I'm struggling with the idea that something of this magnitude can only put out the sound of 2 people having a conversation 3 feet away from each other. It doesn't, common sense wise, it doesn't make sense to me. So,
Well, it actually, that maybe I misled you with that comment, but the noise level that this equipment is generating at the residential property lines is in the 30s, in the low to mid 30 decibel range. The 50 decibels is just the standard that the state says you have to meet at your property line. This facility is not generating 50 decibels at the property line, it's generating 30. For every 10 decibel change, it cuts the noise level in half. So at 40 decibels, you're half as loud as you are at 50. At 30 decibels, you're 1/4 as loud as you would be at 50 decibels. So this facility is generating 1/4 the noise of what the standard is set at 50 decibels. And the reverse is true too. If you increase the noise levels by 10 decibels, you double the sound. So what you're looking at the residence is noise levels that are not half as loud, but 1/4 as loud as what you're allowed to generate at your property line and not have an impact. So,
And can I also just ask you to repeat the distance we're talking about here from the regulator and the heater to, since Mr. Pesci, you had mentioned the site 3, Mr. Potento, we're not talking about 3 feet. We're talking about, could you just repeat that for the record?
yeah, at site 3, the regulator is 530 feet away from the residence itself.
Back up.
And it's the regulator, which is depicted in,
We should probably identify this for the record because we pre-marked it at the last hearing and I don't believe that it was identified. So could you just describe
Yes,
what this is? It's marked A11.
it's marked A11. It's the exhibit of the sound barrier, and this was also taken at the facility in Old Bridge.
It was also part of the record, the photo you were looking at earlier.
Yeah.
It's the very same thing.
last week. Now, one thing I will say, and when I took measurements of this facility, this regulator, when it was in full operation, and I've set my instrument up 1 meter away from the regulator valve, and I recorded a noise level of 79 decibels in full operation. The data from the manufacturers said 84 decibels at 1 meter. So I used the manufacturer's data, which I believe was to be more accurate because I only took one reading, or multiple readings that were at 79, and I used the 84. So I believe that, it's physics and it's very predictable, as I said before. So if you know the noise level at 3 feet away from the source, you can project out to the residence at 575 feet, and you can determine what that noise level would be without mitigation. With the sound wall in place, it's enough mitigation to make sure that you're not increasing the ambient noise at that residence above what they experience out there today at night. So I'm very comfortable with that. It's a very easy thing to predict. The only time it gets more complex is when you have dozens of sources operating on the
The
site.
measurement you took is at the Old Bridge facility,
Correct.
and that's what's depicted in the picture.
That's correct.
And that's going to be exactly what we're having now.
It's the same, it was the same type for, but the new piece of equipment that we're going to be using is a closed system. There's no way to bleed it out, so there'll be no gas odors or anything coming from this facility.
But I was just going to clarify, I think we stated at the last hearing that this is the most similar regulator piece of equipment that will be part of this facility. Remembering we gave you 3 different photos in an effort to try and clarify what each piece of equipment, the most similar type of equipment that would be at this facility.
Mr. Matanga, I think you mentioned that you're going to provide mitigation, but I don't recall you explaining to the board, exactly what it is, the colors, its material.
Okay. I do have that information in the attachment to my report. bear with me one moment while I find it. Okay, the acoustical panel that's shown in figure A11, the panel's surface is a perforated coated steel or galvanized iron. Inside it is rock wool, which is a material used to absorb sound. And the side is sealed by galvanized iron. The sound insulation provides anywhere from 26 to 62 decibels of sound attenuation based on the frequency of the sound in octave bands. Now, in table 1 of my report, I showed the octave band standards of the state noise code. And in the mitigation analysis in tables 5 and 6, which I didn't really get into in great detail, but that evaluates the octave band noise levels that would be generated by the regulator based on the field measurement adjusted to 84 decibels. And we use that to determine how effective this barrier will be. And based on that analysis in tables 5 and 6, it shows that with the barrier, as shown here, which has been used by New Jersey Natural Gas and other facilities, it is adequate to attenuate the sound from this regulator and comply with the state noise code at each of the receptor sites 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we evaluated. So basically, it not only complies with the A-weighted noise level, but with the octave band standards that I've shown in table 1.
Is the rock wool toxic in any way?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one. Both of these pieces of equipment obviously are powered by natural gas. The 2 pieces of equipment, that's what they run on?
The heater runs on natural gas, correct, and the regulator is just a function of the gas running through the pipeline, I believe.
Okay, and they run 24/7 all the time?
They can, yes.
Do they ever have to be purged? They would purge? Is there a purge period, like every month has to be purged?
I think this would probably be a question for Mr. Sanders at New Jersey Natural Gas.
Okay.
He's sworn. Mr. Sanders.
Your question was, do the regulators need to be purged?
Yeah, every month, every 6 months, is there a purging process that it needs to have?
No, they would need to be purged for any normal purposes. Purging is a specific term, and I'm not quite sure what that function would be, but we would not need to purge or touch this equipment.
It just runs.
It runs on pneumatics.
Okay.
I have a question which I'm not sure if would go to either expert. Vibrations for the equipment, could that be felt in the ground for either of these?
I have to say, I was out at the site, at the regulator site, shown in Exhibit A11, and there was no vibration sound. It was just the flow of gas through the pipe that created the heater is basically combustion units. They're very similar in nature to a furnace operating in your house, and I don't believe that a combustion unit that vibrates or would create any vibration, especially if there was vibration from the unit itself, it would have been picked up in the noise levels that were measured for the unit provided by the manufacturer, and at those low levels, at 3 feet apart of 56 decibels, I doubt that there was any vibration that would be noticeable.
And nothing that you feel on the ground?
Correct.
Mr. Potenta, during the course of maintenance at the site, is there a possibility of louder sounds, decibels coming from the site that would be outside the scope of what's being allowed?
I don't believe so. I would imagine during maintenance, they'd have to shut the equipment down and shut the pipeline down if they had to do something with the valves.
I can have Mr. Sanders, who testified at the last hearing on operations, respond to that.
That would be great.
During the normal maintenance and operations, it wouldn't exceed the running decibel levels, because again, during the maintenance, we would be either doing a tear down or doing some type of shutdown, partial shutdown of the system.
That's what I assumed.
Sound completed.
Okay. Mr. Potenta, can you take the board through the process that you undertook for purposes of your air quality study and your conclusions?
Yes. Okay, so again, we were engaged by New Jersey Natural Gas to perform an assessment of air emissions related to the equipment on site and the effect that that might have on nearby residential and agricultural land use. We evaluated pollutants generated by the proposed heater combustion unit, and we evaluated the concentration of those emissions in pollution levels at 5 receptor locations. And now we'll refer to Exhibit A15, which is the air quality receptor sites. And this is a board modeling the figure 1 in the air quality report, showing the receptor locations that were evaluated. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But we looked at basically the property line location, again, of the nearest residence. We looked at the actual residence itself. We looked at the near property line to the northwest, which is another residence and vineyard. And we looked at the actual residence, which is Site 4. And then we also looked at the commercial building on the site immediately adjacent to the facility. We used the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the NJDEP risk screening analysis method, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA air pollution emission factor document, which is the Bible for sources in terms of what types of pollutants there are. We found that the proposed regulator station will have no adverse impact on the DEP's air quality standards or local air concentrations at any of the receptors. And basically, an NJDEP air permit is not required for this heater. It is considered an insignificant source. They don't require permits for that. But I understand that you want to know what type of pollutant emissions we're talking about. So my study looked at the pollutant emissions and shows how negligible they are and why a permit is not required. So we addressed on page 1 of my report, if you have that handy, I'm referring to table 1, I'm sorry, page 2 of my report. And we addressed compliance with what the EPA and the state of New Jersey calls the criteria air pollutants. There are primary standards and there are secondary standards. The primary air pollution standards are meant to protect public health. The secondary standards are intended to protect public welfare, and that includes any decrease in visibility due to pollution, or damage to animals, crops, vegetation, and buildings. And we also noted in the noise report that there will be no odors emitted from this equipment, either the regulator or the heater. The regulator is a closed operating system. It's not like the one in Old Bridge. It is closed. There will be no gas leaks from it. And there are no odors released from the heater, and the heater, as well as the regulator, will be continuously monitored to make sure they're performing the way they were intended. The New Jersey, the DEP standards in Table 1 we addressed the concentrations of the criteria pollutants, including nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, both what's known as PM10 and PM2.5. Those are inhalable particulates. We addressed sulfur dioxide emissions from the heater. We addressed lead concentrations from the heater. And we also addressed ozone. But ozone we addressed as the additional emissions from the heater, because the heater doesn't emit ozones. It emits pollutants that react in the atmosphere that can create ozone, so you have to look at it differently. In the state of Jersey, they just look at that on a total emissions basis. And the same applies to total emissions for other potential pollutants from the heater that do not have federal and state air quality standards. And those pollutants include volatile organic compounds, which are VOCs, carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, nitrous oxides, and we compared them to the DEP statewide emissions inventory data, which is what they use to determine the likelihood of ozone formation and greenhouse gas emissions, and what effect the regulations that they impose on industry and transportation in the state of New Jersey might have on those pollutants. The unfortunate thing is that with the pollutants that affect ozone levels and greenhouse gas emissions, because of the reaction time, a lot of those emissions that they monitor in the state of New Jersey are from pollutants emitted south of here and out, not in the state of New Jersey, but in other states. So it's a difficult thing to control. The state tries to control what industry emits in this state, but they can't control what's being emitted in other states. So they look at it on a total emissions basis, and if they're doing good, if their emission levels are down, they take credit for that, but they can't control what's going on elsewhere. So it's a gauge, it's a good way to look at those pollutants that there are no standards for. Well, how much is being emitted by this heater, and how does that compare to all the other major sources that are controlled in the state of New Jersey, where they have to meet emission limits. So that's basically what we did in our analysis. And the primary and secondary standards for criteria air pollutants were evaluated using the state DEP's recommended modeling procedure for risk assessment due to air pollution. That model uses AirMod, which is the acronym for an EPA sanctioned model that experts use to calculate concentrations of pollutants from a source. So we took that screening method, we looked up in AP 42, EPA's emission factor document, we looked up the emission factors for these criteria air pollutants, and we plugged them into that model, and we came up with the concentrations that are shown in Table 2 for the small boilers that will be in the heater. If we just turn to Table 2 and talk about that now. We analyzed these concentrations at each of these 5 receptors. And receptor 1 is located at the property line across the street, the joint property line of the abandoned residence and the occupied residence. And that is 367 feet from the heater at that property line, the same distance that was analyzed in the noise report. We looked at the nearest residence, which is Site 2, that's the actual physical residence, which is 575 feet away. We analyzed the impact of the heater at Site 3, which is the property line of the resident and vineyard to the northwest, and that is 440 feet away from the heater, the same distance as in the noise analysis. And we then looked at the actual residence on that site, which is over 1,000 feet, 1,050 feet away from the heater. And then we decided that because this is a commercial building and there are people in there, we would look and see just how much emissions from this heater might impact this building. And that's only 256 feet away from the heater. The results in Table 2, I didn't want to use scientific notation and talk about concentration times 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 6, because I wanted to make sure you could see the dramatic number difference between the maximum concentration being emitted by this heater and the standards. So let's take Site 1, the residential property line in Table 2. 367 feet east of the heater. And the maximum concentration for nitrogen dioxide, the air quality levels are 1/100th of the standard. The air quality concentration for the secondary standard is 1/1000th of the standard. And if you go down, I'm not going to go through each and every one, but if you go down and you look at the levels that are being emitted compared to the standards, you can see that these numbers are very small. The concentrations are very small. And I have one example that I pulled out because carbon monoxide. There's a 35 part per million 1 hour standard, and there's a 9 part per million 8 hour standard. Let's look at the 8 hour standard. The standard is not being 9 parts per million for 8 hours. And the concentration of carbon monoxide from the heater is 0.00096, 1/1000 of the standard. And what that means, to put it in perspective, is to get 1 part per million of carbon monoxide emitted at Site 1, you need 1,000 heaters. To make 9 parts per million of carbon monoxide, which would be equal to the standard, you need over 9,000 heaters to be operating simultaneously. So, I mean, that gives you an order of magnitude of how insignificant these emissions are from the heater. And if anything, this is just one example of why the heater is not considered a significant source and not required to have an air permit by the DEP. So, if you go through and look at every site and every concentration, you see the same thing happens at all the sites. The levels are negligible at the property line, they're negligible at Site 1, they're negligible at Site 2, the actual residence, they're negligible at Site 3, the property line of the farm and vineyard, and they're negligible at the residence. They're even negligible at the closest receptor, the commercial building, 256 feet away. So the heater is not an issue. From my perspective, this wasn't an impact assessment. This was just an evaluation of a source to confirm why the DEP doesn't require a permit, why you don't need to do an assessment for something this small. And what we concluded was that the heater will not have any adverse impact on local air quality, that the project-generated criteria air pollutant concentrations at the near receptors are negligible, and in many cases what are considered trace amounts of pollutant, which means they're below negligible. They're not even a consideration for any permitting of any sort. That we found the same, came to the same conclusion for those pollutants that I addressed in my report, that for carbon dioxide, methane, VOCs, water vapor, these are considered pollutants because of the effect they have on formation of ozone and greenhouse gas emissions. And again, these are negligible for these compounds from the facility. And again, the facility won't emit any odors. Without getting into all of the numbers that are in the air quality report for the emissions for which there are no standards, including, as I mentioned, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, water vapor. We have shown in the report and compared the emission levels from the heater using the EPA's AP42 emission factor document, and we've shown what the emissions would be on an annual basis for this heater. And based on those emission levels for these pollutants that don't have standards, we've shown in comparison to the DEP's inventory data for emissions of these pollutants that they're totally insignificant levels, will have no impact on existing air quality or existing emissions that you might monitored in the state of New Jersey. A lot of these pollutants, especially the criteria air pollutants, aren't even monitored in the state of New Jersey anymore because they feel that they have in compliance and have met the standards that have been imposed upon the state by the EPA to show compliance. So what this study has shown is that the emissions from the heater aren't going to affect the standards. They're not going to affect whatever the ambient levels are out there. They're just so insignificant. It just makes me come to the conclusion that it's a great example of why there is no permit required for this heater. And that pretty much sums up the report and the findings. And I know you're going to have a lot of questions, and I'll try to answer them.
Before the board, I'm assuming the board has questions, but I did want to go over some of the questions that were raised, as Ms. Avron mentioned at the last hearing, in the HEC memos, as well as a couple of the review letters by Mr. Plousis, if I could do that now to just... Okay. So we received a total, I think, of 3 review memos from the HEC, Mr. Patenta. I believe you're familiar with those, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the first memo I'm going to direct your attention to is the memo dated June 11th, 2018 from the HEC. And in that memo, the HEC asks whether the nearby Category 1 waters will be affected by the airborne discharge from the proposed station. Could you provide your response to that to the board?
Sure. Well, as I stated in a response letter that I drafted on August 30th, 2018, in response to the HEC memo of August 9th. In that letter, I talked about the air quality assessment evaluating emissions generated by the combustion units in the heater equipment. And the conclusion of the air quality report, as I mentioned earlier, that there would be no negligible effects on pollutant levels at nearby residential, commercial, agricultural land use near the project site. The air quality study results show, again, that the pollutants emitted by the heater are negligible compared to both US EPA and NJDEP air quality standards, or other major emissions of these pollutants based on the inventory of the NJDEP for those pollutants, showing basically that the project will not have any negative impact on air quality. And based on the air quality study findings, there is no potential for any project air pollution impact on water quality through atmospheric deposition, as stated in that letter, whereby precipitation might carry airborne pollutants from the heater to the earth, affecting water bodies. Yeah, the heater emissions are so low. If you think about, as I mentioned earlier, existing air quality out there, it's generated by sources in the state, sources out of the state. The emissions from this heater are so negligible. There's no difference in what the air quality, existing air quality levels are out there today. So there's not going to be any increase in potential deposition of these pollutants from the heater into the water quality. It's a beyond negligible effect. And since the heater emissions do not have any impact on the air quality standards, the project certainly isn't going to result in degradation of water quality standards, even if they were applicable to air quality emissions, and they're not. And therefore, any negative impact on Category 1 waters for the swimming river reservoir watershed will not occur as a result of emissions from the heater.
Just to clarify for the board, when you say negligible, what do you mean?
Well, I think I tried to explain it, but negligible emissions are so insignificant in quantity. They are considered by the regulatory agency to have no effect or no impact on pollutant levels. And they can be considered as not having any potential impact on air quality, which again is why they don't require permits.
Okay, Mr. Potenta, the HEC also circulated a memo dated August 9th, 2018, and in that memo, they assert that the emissions from the proposed regulator facility would cause degradation to the C1 waters in the swimming river reservoir watershed. Could you respond to that?
Yes, and my response is a little redundant because it's, again, responded to in my August 30th letter to the August 9, 2018 HEC memo. And it's my expert opinion that there's no potential for any air pollution impacts from the project on water quality through atmospheric deposition, since the heater emissions will not result in any impact to existing air quality or corresponding air quality standards. The project will not result in any air emissions related degradation of existing water quality or cause any negative impact on C1 waters of the swimming river reservoir watershed or its tributaries.
And then likewise in that memo, the HEC asserted that the anti-degradation provisions of the stormwater rules would require NJNG to provide proof that it would not cause any negative impact to water quality. Could you discuss that?
Yes. In that, again, in that letter, I responded, the letter of August 30th, that the DEP's Division of Air Quality is responsible for source emissions of air pollution. The NJDEP stormwater rules on anti-degradation provisions apply to discharges of surface water or groundwater or stormwater runoff that affects water quality, not to source emissions of air pollution. So the stormwater rules define pollutant as the definition of pollutant discharges that do not include air pollutant emissions such as those related from the heater. As I testified based on my findings of the report,